It mimicked our dog. Terrifying encounters with the unknown. If you're listening to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple, or another podcast app, I have some exciting news. This is our milestone, 500th episode. 1,000 narratives delving into the darkest corners of human experience. Tonight's episode features several bone-chilling encounters with mimics, entities that can take the shape of familiar beings, including one creature that assumed the form of someone's beloved pet to terrorize them. Now, let darkness envelop us as we begin. It Mimicked My Dog. Submitted by Elite Puma 50. This happened early last year, around March. I have an Irish Terrier named Harley. My family and I had moved into a new house in January. This place, it wasn't right from the beginning. Something about it clawed at my subconscious. The walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The corners felt too sharp, the ceilings too low. I tried explaining this sensation to my parents, but they dismissed my concerns, attributing them to nerves about relocating yet again. "You'll adjust," they said. But I'd never experienced this visceral rejection with any previous home. The house seemed to breathe when we weren't looking, as if testing the air, learning our scents. We were financially comfortable, so we always lived in spacious homes, a necessity with 8 of us. My parents, myself, and my 5 siblings. Being the second oldest often placed me in charge when the adults were away, as my older sister frequently disappeared with her boyfriend. It was a Saturday afternoon, when my older sister and parents were out, leaving me responsible for my younger siblings. The youngest, V, wanted to take Harley for a walk. Given her age, I had to accompany her. We informed the others we'd return soon, and set out. It was around 1:30 p.m. V and I planned our usual 40-minute route, giving Harley ample opportunity to explore. 25 minutes into our walk, my oldest brother D called. His voice trembled as he spoke. "There's something scratching at the door. It sounds like Harley." I felt a cold wave wash over me. "That's impossible. V and I have Harley with us right now." Silence stretched between us for several heartbeats. Then D whispered, "I don't think it's a dog anymore." A nervous laugh escaped me, but it died when I registered the genuine terror in his voice. This wasn't one of his pranks. Something was wrong. Very wrong. V, Harley, and I immediately turned back, transforming our leisurely stroll into a desperate race against an invisible clock. We covered the 15-minute return journey in just 10 minutes, our lungs burning. As we approached the front door, I froze. There, standing motionless on our porch, was what appeared to be another Harley. My mind struggled to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. Perhaps another neighborhood dog with similar coloring. Then it turned toward us. Its eyes, they weren't a dog's eyes at all. They glowed with an unnatural amber luminescence, like molten honey suspended in darkness. They captured my gaze, paralyzing me. I couldn't look away, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to those glowing points of alien intelligence. V's scream jolted me back to reality. This thing wasn't just a strange dog. It wasn't a dog at all. The creature's body began to twist, contorting in ways no living animal's skeleton should permit. Then came the sound, a piercing, otherworldly screech that penetrated our skulls. It resonated like a woman's agonized cry, harmonized with a feline's threatening hiss, amplified to impossible volumes. The sound physically hurt, making our ears throb. V and I stood frozen, torn between the need to flee and the knowledge that our siblings remained inside. The entity started moving toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural at first, like a marionette with half its strings cut. We ran. I called D, gasping instructions to evacuate everyone through the rear exit. We rendezvoused at our neighbor's home, called the authorities and our parents. No one believed us, of course. The police arrived, examined the deep claw marks gouging our front door, and concluded it must have been a desperate wild animal at worst. They departed, leaving us with patronizing smiles and hollow reassurances. But we knew what we'd seen. Something had studied our dog, learned its shape, and attempted to use that familiarity to gain entry to our home, to gain access to us. We refused to walk Harley alone after that. Despite being 15, I slept with my bedroom door barricaded. That memory has burrowed deep into my psyche. The glowing eyes, the unnatural movements, the sound that no earthly creature could produce. My family moved shortly thereafter. We never speak of what happened, but sometimes I catch my siblings watching the shadows too carefully, or staring at Harley with momentary uncertainty in their eyes, wondering perhaps if what we're seeing is truly our dog. It mimicked my dog. Submitted by Elite Puma 50. This happened early last year, around March. I have an Irish Terrier named Harley. My family and I had moved into a new house in January. This place, it wasn't right from the beginning. Something about it clawed at my subconscious. The walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The corners felt too sharp, the ceilings too low. I tried explaining this sensation to my parents, but they dismissed my concerns, attributing them to nerves about relocating yet again. "You'll adjust," they said. But I'd never experienced this visceral rejection with any previous home. The house seemed to breathe when we weren't looking, as if testing the air, learning our scents. We were financially comfortable, so we always lived in spacious homes, a necessity with 8 of us: my parents, myself, and my 5 siblings. Being the second oldest often placed me in charge when the adults were away, as my older sister frequently disappeared with her boyfriend. It was a Saturday afternoon, when my older sister and parents were out, leaving me responsible for my younger siblings. The youngest, V, wanted to take Harley for a walk. Given her age, I had to accompany her. We informed the others we'd return soon, and set out. It was around 1:30 p.m. V and I planned our usual 40-minute route, giving Harley ample opportunity to explore. 25 minutes into our walk, my oldest brother D called. His voice trembled as he spoke. "There's something scratching at the door. It sounds like Harley." I felt a cold wave wash over me. "That's impossible. V and I have Harley with us right now." Silence stretched between us for several heartbeats. Then D whispered, "I don't think it's a dog anymore." A nervous laugh escaped me, but it died when I registered the genuine terror in his voice. This wasn't one of his pranks. Something was wrong. Very wrong. V, Harley, and I immediately turned back, transforming our leisurely stroll into a desperate race against an invisible clock. We covered the 15-minute return journey in just 10 minutes, our lungs burning. As we approached the front door, I froze. There, standing motionless on our porch, was what appeared to be another Harley. My mind struggled to rationalize what my eyes were seeing. Perhaps another neighborhood dog with similar coloring. Then it turned toward us. Its eyes, they weren't a dog's eyes at all. They glowed with an unnatural amber luminescence, like molten honey suspended in darkness. They captured my gaze, paralyzing me. I couldn't look away, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to those glowing points of alien intelligence. V's scream jolted me back to reality. This thing wasn't just a strange dog. It wasn't a dog at all. The creature's body began to twist, contorting in ways no living animal's skeleton should permit. Then came the sound, a piercing, otherworldly screech that penetrated our skulls. It resonated like a woman's agonized cry, harmonized with a feline's threatening hiss, amplified to impossible volumes. The sound physically hurt, making our ears throb. V and I stood frozen, torn between the need to flee and the knowledge that our siblings remained inside. The entity started moving toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural at first, like a marionette with half its strings cut. We ran. I called D, gasping instructions to evacuate everyone through the rear exit. We rendezvoused at our neighbor's home, called the authorities and our parents. No one believed us, of course. The police arrived, examined the deep claw marks gouging our front door, and concluded it must have been a desperate wild animal at worst. They departed, leaving us with patronizing smiles and hollow reassurances. But we knew what we'd seen. Something had studied our dog, learned its shape, and attempted to use that familiarity to gain entry to our home, to gain access to us. We refused to walk Harley alone after that. Despite being 15, I slept with my bedroom door barricaded. That memory has burrowed deep into my psyche. The glowing eyes, the unnatural movements, the sound that no earthly creature could produce. My family moved shortly thereafter. We never speak of what happened, but sometimes I catch my siblings watching the shadows too carefully, or staring at Harley with momentary uncertainty in their eyes, wondering perhaps if what we're seeing is truly our dog. Wendigo Encounters in Appalachia? Submitted by Afroman. Note: names and specific locations have been altered for privacy. Summer of 2005 stretched before us like a promise. Our small North Carolina town seemed less confining for once, as we, newly graduated and facing divergent futures, planned one final wilderness adventure. Our trio consisted of myself, Lucas, my best friend Cody, with his wild hair and wilder imagination, and Michelle, Cody's ex-girlfriend, but still my closest confidant. Michelle possessed practical skills. Her father taught her to hunt at age 10, and she kept a knife concealed in her boot. I was the chronicler, documenting our experiences in a weathered notebook. We selected Red Hollow for our excursion, an unmarked stretch of forest along the Blue Ridge Parkway. We'd hiked there countless times, but never stayed overnight. It was Michelle's suggestion, one final adventure before college separated us. The first evening unfolded perfectly. The night sky seemed lower than usual, stars suspended just beyond reach. The air vibrated with cicada song as we passed Cody's smuggled whiskey between us. Michelle recounted local legends, particularly that of the Wendigo, the insatiable spirit that allegedly stalked these ancient woodlands. Cody laughed dismissively. I didn't. Something about her words sank into my consciousness like stones into a still pond. Stories heard in comfortable living rooms transform entirely when whispered in darkness beneath ancient trees. Dawn arrived with ominous gray clouds and an unsettling odor, decay mixed with something metallic and sharp. Cody joked it must be his unwashed socks, but Michelle silenced him with a glare. It's not funny, she snapped. We fell silent, recognizing her sudden tension. Throughout the day the stench intensified, clinging to us like an invisible film. Each breath tasted of copper pennies and putrefaction. We ventured deeper into the woods, seeking the abandoned cabin Cody had heard about, hoping to distance ourselves from the nauseating air. But the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, unnaturally still, heavy. Even Cody's nervous chatter eventually died away. We discovered the cabin as daylight began to fade, a dilapidated structure listing precariously, as if balanced on a fulcrum. The door hung askew from rusted hinges. Inside, the wooden floor was carpeted with decaying leaves and unidentifiable debris. Michelle noticed it first, a strange symbol carved into the wall beside the fireplace, a circle with jagged rays emanating outward, resembling a malevolent sun. Her face drained of color. We need to leave, now. Her voice was barely audible, but Cody was already examining a rusted hunting knife he'd discovered among the debris. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, we heard it, a low guttural growl from somewhere in the surrounding forest. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. The sound bypassed my conscious mind and triggered something primal, a visceral urge to flee. Just a coyote, Cody suggested, but his voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. Michelle glared at him. That is not a coyote. We abandoned our exploration and headed back toward camp, but the forest had transformed. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. That noxious odor intensified with each step, and the intermittent growling seemed to encircle us, drawing ever closer. Then we saw it. The entity stood impossibly tall, its proportions a mockery of human anatomy, limbs elongated beyond reason, flesh stretched taut over a framework that seemed more architectural than biological. Its skin had the pallor of winter ice, semi-translucent in the fading light. The face, if it could be called such, resembled a deer's skull picked clean by scavengers, with eyes that emanated a sickly phosphorescence. Cody swore breathlessly as Michelle reached for her concealed blade. I remained paralyzed, muscles refusing to obey basic survival instincts. The creature tilted its head with a sound like brittle branches breaking. Then it spoke. The sound defies description even now. It wasn't merely the creature's voice that chilled me, it was the sensation that accompanied it. The entity wasn't speaking to us, but into us, as if its words bypassed our ears and materialized directly within our minds. The voice carried the weight of centuries, of ancient hunger, of countless previous encounters that had ended in unspeakable ways. It shrieked then, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of reality around us. We ran. The forest blurred into a chaotic montage of shadows and branches. I heard Cody shouting behind me, but survival instinct propelled me forward without looking back. I emerged into a clearing, lungs burning and legs trembling, only to realize I was alone. Michelle and Cody were gone. Panic seized me as I spun in circles, calling their names into the gathering darkness. That's when I saw it again, those luminous eyes, observing me from the tree line. The entity remained motionless, watching with predatory patience, as if savoring my terror. I fled until I reached the highway, nearly collapsing with relief, when Michelle and Cody emerged from the forest minutes later. We flagged down a passing truck, clambering inside its cab, with incoherent gratitude. We told the driver, and later the police, about an animal attack, knowing the truth would sound delusional. We've never returned to Red Hollow. Sometimes I'll catch Michelle's eye at family gatherings, and I know she's remembering too. The symbol, the smell, the voice that spoke inside our minds, the hunger that has existed in those mountains, long before humans named them. That is not my mother. Submitted by Serena Karina. This happened when I was 15. Just a couple years ago. I was home alone while my parents were at work. I'm an only child, but I have a Rottweiler mix named Stella, who's my constant companion. It was early morning. I sat at our kitchen table, eating breakfast and working on a school project due the next day. Our modest house features a kitchen with a large window overlooking the dense forest behind our property. A short hallway leads to the bedrooms, mine at the very end, visible from the hallway entrance, and my parents' room being the first door on the left. Stella dozed contentedly under the table while I worked. Without warning, scratching sounds erupted at our back door. I glanced down to confirm Stella was still beside me. She was. I approached the window cautiously, scanning the area outside, but saw nothing. Perhaps some wildlife had passed by. I returned to my work, dismissing the incident. About 20 minutes later, having completed my project, I headed to the refrigerator for a drink. The scratching resumed, more insistent this time. Stella emerged from under the table, approached the door, and began growling, a deep, threatening sound I'd never heard her make before. I checked outside again. Still nothing visible. Unnerved, I called Stella to follow me to my bedroom, where we could hide safely until my parents returned. I was idly scrolling through social media when I heard my mother's voice call my name from within the house. This made no sense. Mom worked late shifts and wouldn't be home until around 10 p.m. It was barely afternoon. Stella began growling again, but louder, more aggressively. I hushed her desperately, fearing whatever was out there would hear us. "Stella, shut up," I whispered harshly. Miraculously, she obeyed. I could hear floorboards creaking as something moved through our house, deliberate, weighted steps approaching my bedroom. But they didn't reach my door. Instead, they diverted to my parents' room. Their door opened, then closed. I sat frozen, tears streaming silently down my face. With trembling hands, I called my mother. She didn't believe me naturally, but promised to check in regularly and to call if anything escalated. Time crawled. 5 minutes felt like hours. Stella maintained a low, continuous growl, her eyes fixed on my bedroom door. After what felt like eternity, but was probably an hour, I called my mother again. No longer caring if I sounded childish. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Please come home." To her credit, she agreed immediately. When I heard her car in the driveway, her actual car, with the distinctive rattle in the engine I recognized, Stella and I bolted from the bedroom toward her. Mom was annoyed, convinced I'd overreacted. To prove nothing was amiss, she marched to their bedroom, throwing open the door triumphantly. "See? Nothing here." Then she opened the closet door. I've never seen color drain from someone's face so rapidly. In one fluid motion, she grabbed my arm, commanded Stella to follow, and we ran. Not walked, but ran out of the house, into our neighbor's home. We practically collapsed into our neighbor's living room, gasping apologies between labored breaths. After calling my father and the authorities, we explained what had happened. Our neighbor's expression shifted from confusion to horror. "When I first moved to this neighborhood," she began hesitantly, "I was warned about something in those woods. I dismissed it as local superstition until I experienced it myself." She described an identical encounter, scratching at her door, followed by hearing her deceased sister's voice inside her home. Whatever entity it was had retreated to her spare bedroom. When her husband investigated, he discovered glowing yellow eyes peering from beneath their bed. "My memory grows fuzzy about how we removed it," she admitted. "But it's dangerous, potentially lethal." By the time the police arrived with my father, we were thoroughly terrified. 2 officers entered our house, while 1 remained with us. When they emerged 15 minutes later, their expressions mirrored the fear we felt. They admitted seeing something, an entity mimicking a deceased colleague. But with disturbing differences. It was about a foot taller than he ever was, one officer explained. Voice unsteady. And when it spoke, it sounded like our friend's voice, layered with something inhuman. We didn't return home that night, or for many nights after. Eventually, we moved back, finding no trace of the entity. But the woods behind our house seemed darker now. The shadows deeper, the silence more expectant. We remain vigilant, because whatever was in our home that day, whatever borrowed my mother's voice and watched officers with glowing eyes, it's still out there, waiting, listening, learning to mimic more perfectly. Next time. Family folklore from Olcott Beach. Submitted by Anonymous. My great-aunt Peggy, the youngest of 5 sisters, developed an overwhelming premonition of her own mortality. This wasn't a passing thought. It consumed her. She became convinced, with absolute certainty, that she wouldn't live past her 17th birthday. At first, my great-grandmother Josephine dismissed these claims. The year was 1934, and maintaining a household with 5 daughters and a working-class husband left little patience for what she perceived as attention-seeking behavior. Between the endless cycle of laundry with an old-style wringer washer, cooking meals on a wood-burning stove, and managing a household with an icebox instead of a refrigerator, Josephine had precious little energy for teenage dramatics. But as weeks passed, Aunt Peggy's fear intensified. It wasn't merely talk. A profound dread had taken hold of her, manifesting in sleepless nights and vacant eyes. Her obsession eventually prompted my superstitious Irish-American family to seek counsel from the parish priest at Sacred Heart Church. Despite his prayers and guidance, nothing alleviated Aunt Peggy's conviction that death approached. What complicated matters was our family history. My great-great-grandmother Mary possessed the gift, or perhaps curse, of reading tea leaves. Before tea bags existed, loose-leaf tea would leave patterns at the bottom of a cup, which skilled readers could interpret to glimpse the future. One afternoon, she read her youngest daughter's cup and went pale. What she saw disturbed her so profoundly that she immediately washed the cup and placed it aside, saying nothing. Shortly afterward, that daughter, my great-great-aunt Mary, died from what was officially labeled spinal meningitis, though the timing suggests it might have been the Spanish flu of 1918. This event cemented our family's belief in premonitions. My great-great-grandmother never read tea leaves again. Years later, in 1934, my great-aunt Catherine, then 18, received an invitation to dine at the Plantation, an exclusive establishment at the corner of Military Road and Niagara Falls Boulevard. In those days, this was the height of sophistication, a gathering place for society from western New York to Ontario. Today, that elegant corner hosts nothing but strip malls and barren parking lots. Catherine, sensing her younger sister needed distraction from her morbid obsession, invited Peggy to accompany her and her date for the evening. Initially, Peggy accepted, but at the last moment, she inexplicably declined. The journey from Niagara Falls to the plantation required traveling along Pine Avenue and then Niagara Falls Boulevard, not the divided highway of today, but a winding country road with treacherous curves. Details of the accident have faded with time, but it appears speed was a factor. The Model A failed to navigate a sharp bend and overturned. Catherine survived the initial impact. Despite suffering a fractured skull, she managed, through sheer determination, to reach St. Mary's Hospital on 6th Street. The hospital, built in 1912, had no emergency room. Patients climbed a winding staircase to reach admissions. Catherine accomplished this feat, leading everyone to believe she would recover. Hours later, she succumbed to her injuries. The grief that followed Catherine's death overshadowed Peggy's premonition. But something strange occurred. Her sense of impending doom vanished completely. The conviction that had possessed her for months disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. My great-aunt Peggy lived to the remarkable age of 91, passing peacefully in 2009. But our family never forgot the inexplicable forewarning that saved her life while failing to save her sisters. Some things, it seems, are written in the leaves of fate. Skinwalker, Up in the Woods. Submitted by Anonymous, 419. This occurred during our last visit to my grandfather's cabin in the summer of 2023. My parents, brother and I sleep in tents there, as the small cabin can't accommodate everyone. Normally I cherish those nights under canvas, listening to the symphony of wilderness around us. After what happened, however, I doubt I'll ever feel comfortable in a tent again, or anywhere near those woods. We had planned a peaceful 4-day retreat, Friday through Monday. That Saturday morning, I woke around 9 a.m. and ventured inside for coffee. My grandfather, step-grandmother and mother sat by an open window, sharing quiet conversation between sips of coffee and occasional puffs of cigarettes and vapes. After brewing my coffee and exchanging pleasantries, I rejoined my brother and father outside. We had ignited a small fire in the rock-lined pit my grandfather had constructed specifically for outdoor cooking during summer months. The morning air carried that perfect crispness that makes everything taste better outdoors. My brother volunteered to gather more kindling, disappearing into the tree line, while I sat with Dad, savoring the companionable silence, broken only by the wind's whisper and the fire's gentle crackle. Then we heard it, my brother's scream echoing through the forest. Not a shout or cry of surprise, but a primal sound of pure terror that made my blood crystallize in my veins. The family burst from the cabin, my grandfather emerging last, rifle in hand. We expected a bear, perhaps even a rare coyote encounter. What pursued my brother from the tree line defied classification. The entity stood approximately 7 feet tall, towering over my brother's sprinting form. Its body appeared emaciated beyond the possibility of life, skin stretched over a framework that seemed more architectural than biological. Reddish-brown patches mottled its pallid surface, which I initially mistook for fur, but later realized might have been dried fluid. Most disturbing was its face, if it could be called such. Jagged teeth protruded at unnatural angles, including one that seemed partially dislodged, hanging from what approximated a mouth. My grandfather fired without hesitation. The report echoed through the clearing, but the creature showed no reaction. Either he missed, or the ammunition had no effect. The entity halted at the creek separating the deeper woods from our clearing. My brother, through some miracle of adrenaline, had managed to leap this natural boundary without faltering. The creature stood motionless at the water's edge, observing us with unnatural stillness. We retreated into the cabin, all except my grandfather, who maintained his position, weapon ready. Once inside, he confessed he'd encountered this entity before but kept silent, fearing we wouldn't believe him, or worse, that speaking of it might somehow summon it closer. While we emerged physically unharmed, psychological wounds remain. My brother particularly carries the weight of what he witnessed. Since that day, something fundamental has shifted in him, a light extinguished, replaced by a vigilance that never fully relaxes. We skipped our visit to the cabin this year, ostensibly because of pet care responsibilities. But the truth whispers beneath our excuses. What haunts me most is how this encounter defied the established rules of supernatural experiences. This wasn't a shadowy figure glimpsed at midnight, or a strange sound in darkness. This manifested in broad daylight, under clear skies, when everything should have been safe. My grandfather has reluctantly shared that he's spotted the entity approximately 5 more times since our departure, always in the pre-dawn hours, lurking at the forest's edge, watching the cabin with patient malevolence. We don't know what the creature is, what it wants, or why it seems fixated on our family's retreat. We only know that something ancient and hungry resides in those woods, something that knows our scent now. If you venture into wilderness areas, remember the daylight doesn't guarantee safety. Some predators have waited centuries for an opportunity, and they're learning our habits. The sound of one's own voice. Submitted by RD in Hall. This past February, I very nearly died. It was approximately 3:45 a.m. when I awoke needing to use the bathroom. After attending to this, I realized I'd forgotten something, and turned back. Without warning, I found myself struggling to breathe, my airways constricting as if invisible hands were compressing my throat. Most disturbing of all, I couldn't hear my own voice. Not that I was silent, I could feel my vocal cords straining, feel the vibration in my throat as I gasped for help, but the sound simply didn't reach my ears. It was as if something had severed the connection between my voice and my consciousness. Through incredible fortune, I had my mobile phone with me, having used it as a makeshift flashlight since the bathroom light was non-functional. My oxygen-deprived brain somehow managed to dial emergency services, and I stumbled downstairs to await help outside. Those moments remain etched in my memory, clinging to a bin for support. The world narrowing to a pinpoint as I struggled to draw breath, the profound wrongness of being unable to hear my own desperate attempts to call out. It felt less like a medical emergency, and more like something fundamental about reality had fractured. When the ambulance arrived, I collapsed onto the pavement. Darkness claimed me. I later learned I was placed in an induced coma for 36 hours. My oxygen saturation had plummeted below 40%, a level typically incompatible with survival. My parents were advised to prepare for the worst, but somehow, against medical expectations, my body rallied. The diagnosis was double pneumonia. Fluid and infection had infiltrated both lungs simultaneously. What I'd mistaken for positive health indicators in preceding weeks, particularly rapid weight loss, had actually been warning signs. My body was under siege. For months afterward, I accepted this explanation. Nothing supernatural had occurred. I'd simply experienced a severe medical emergency. I focused on recovery, repairing relationships, and reorganizing my life after this brush with mortality. But something continued to trouble me. The memory of that silence, of being unable to hear my own voice, felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It wasn't just frightening, it felt unnatural. I recalled the weather that night. An unusual cold mist had rolled in from the sea, enveloping the city in an unseasonable chill. And that feeling of being disconnected from my own voice haunted me most of all. As someone who watches paranormal investigation programs, I began to wonder if something more sinister had occurred. 3 months after my hospitalization, I decided to investigate. I conducted a basic spirit communication session, using my phone, keeping talismans from both my grandfathers close. One who served in the army, before becoming a firefighter, the other a Navy man who joined the Coast Guard. I've long sensed their protective presence around me. Initially, the responses seemed benign. Words like protect, soldiers, and family suggested my grandfather's presence. But the atmosphere shifted abruptly. New words appeared: hate, cold, witch, silence. The correlation was undeniable: the cold mist that night, the unnatural silence of my own voice. I terminated the session, sensing hostility building, but also feeling my grandfather's protective presence intensifying around me. A month later, while watching The Little Mermaid, of all things, pieces connected in my mind. I live in a coastal city with strong maritime heritage. The film's antagonist, a sea witch who steals Ariel's voice, triggered a revelation. Many aquatic entities in folklore share a connection to the human voice. They steal breath, mimic voices, or silence their victims. The maritime legends often feature creatures that dominate through controlling sound itself. I believe such an entity targeted me that night, entering on the mist from the sea. It didn't drown me conventionally, but attempted to flood my lungs, while severing my connection to my own voice, the essence of my identity. My remarkable recovery, oxygen levels rising from 39% to 99% in days rather than weeks, suggests intervention beyond medical science. I believe my grandfather's spirits interceded, driving away the malevolent presence and restoring what it had attempted to take. This revelation led me to learn more about my family's history. I discovered this wasn't the first time my grandfather had manifested to protect family members. When I was an infant, my mother recalls him intervening during difficult times with her abusive ex-husband, moving objects, and creating disturbances that offered her moments of safety. Most importantly, I gained a profound appreciation for something we take for granted: the sound of our own voices. That connection between our thoughts and their audible expression forms a cornerstone of human identity. When that entity severed my connection to my voice, it wasn't merely attacking my body. It was attempting to unmoor me from my very sense of self. I don't know why I was targeted. Perhaps I was simply vulnerable, an opportunity that presented itself. But I'm certain the intervention of protective spirits is what allowed me to tell this story today. And I never take for granted the simple miracle of hearing my own voice when I speak.
3 Encounters. Submitted by Olcott Beach. Nearly 40 years ago, I visited Fort Niagara on Christmas Eve. The bitter cold had already ushered in darkness by 4 p.m., and I was surprised to find the fort open at all. A single clerk staffed the gift shop, informing me I had until 6 p.m. to explore. Fort Niagara, for those unfamiliar, is a 3-story stone fortification dating back to the 18th century. I entered with camera in hand, methodically climbing the stairs toward the upper floors, snapping photographs of the austere interior. Everything changed when I reached the 3rd floor. I've never considered myself sensitive to paranormal activity. I'm skeptical by nature, preferring evidence to intuition. Yet the moment I set foot on that uppermost level, every instinct I possessed screamed danger. The air felt dense, almost electrically charged. The hair on my neck and arms stood rigid, and an overwhelming sensation of being unwelcome, of being watched by something ancient and territorial, washed over me. I felt a pressure against my chest and back, as if invisible hands were physically pushing me toward the staircase. I retreated immediately, practically running down the stairs. With each step downward, the oppressive sensation gradually diminished, until upon reaching the ground floor, it had almost completely dissipated. Years later, I've encountered others who experienced identical sensations in that same location. Whatever resides on the 3rd floor of Fort Niagara remains there still, fiercely guarding its domain against intrusion. Asterisk. Asterisk. The presence at Tam. Ceramics. Asterisk. Asterisk. My second encounter occurred while working for Tam. Ceramics in Niagara Falls. The company's main office occupied a site where a farmhouse and barn had stood prior to 1906, when titanium alloy manufacturing began operations. Working late in the engineering department became routine for me. As colleagues departed one by one, a curious sensation would gradually intensify, the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. This wasn't a threatening presence. Unlike Fort Niagara, nothing about this entity wanted me to leave. It simply existed alongside me, sharing the space with a kind of benign indifference. The feeling was so convincing that I would frequently cross the building to check if a purchasing agent might still be working. I never found anyone, yet the sensation of a presence remained undeniable. I later discussed this with a purchasing agent who admitted experiencing identical perceptions. Whatever remnant of the original property's occupants lingered there, seemed content merely to observe, harboring no malevolence toward those who now inhabited their former domain. My third account proves most difficult to articulate, as it concerns experiences from early childhood, night terrors that manifested with disturbing consistency in one specific bedroom of my father's house. These episodes would begin with a distinctive sensation, a hollow sinking feeling in my stomach that served as warning. Within moments my perception would distort, the room stretching into an elongated tunnel, distances warping impossibly. Simultaneously, an invisible weight would press me into the mattress, rendering me completely immobile. These paralytic states would persist until I somehow broke free through sheer desperation, leaping from the bed and fleeing the room. The episodes always left me trembling and unnaturally cold, as if my core temperature had dropped dangerously. Most disturbing was the daytime occurrence. While alone in that same bedroom, that familiar hollow sensation returned. I fled immediately, but as I reached the doorway, an invisible force began pulling me backward toward the room's center. I gripped the corner where the corridor turned 90 degrees, using it as leverage to resist the pull. Once I managed to turn that corner, the pulling sensation ceased instantly. When my sister later moved downstairs, my stepbrother and I relocated to a different bedroom. The experiences never recurred. My stepsister, who subsequently occupied the room where these incidents occurred, never reported anything unusual. In retrospect, these childhood experiences sound like textbook sleep paralysis combined with an overactive imagination. Yet the visceral memory of that pulling sensation, the desperate struggle to escape the room's gravity during full wakefulness and daylight, these details suggest something beyond conventional explanation. Whatever presence claimed, that bedroom seemed specifically fixated on me, leaving others who occupied the space entirely undisturbed. North Carolina Wendigo. Submitted by BooMac20. In July 2020, at 18 years old, I experienced something that fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. My family lived in a modest house on the outskirts of a small town in North Carolina's foothills. While not deeply isolated, our property bordered dense forest that stretched toward the mountains. From our porch, the distant town remained barely visible, close enough that we occasionally heard traffic or neighbors' dogs, yet remote enough that the surrounding woods created a pervasive silence that could feel either peaceful or isolating, depending on one's mindset. We maintained a small homestead with chickens, goats, and a couple of cows. Most evenings passed uneventfully, until that night, the temperature plummeted unexpectedly. In mid-July, when southern humidity typically makes breathing feel like inhaling soup, the thermometer dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. This unnatural cold carried a biting quality that felt invasive, as if it originated from something other than mere weather patterns. I sat in our living room when I realized my phone charger remained in the car. Despite my reluctance to venture into that unseasonable chill, I eventually rose and headed toward the door. The moment I stepped outside, the cold attacked rather than merely surrounded me. Most disturbing was the absolute silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds from town. Just a vacuum of acoustic emptiness that felt deliberate, as if something had systematically silenced every natural sound source. And beneath that silence lay the unmistakable sensation of being observed. As I approached the car, the stillness shattered. Our goats erupted in frantic bleating, not their typical vocalizations, but desperate, terror-stricken cries. They weren't merely frightened, they were experiencing primal panic. "Mom," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the previous silence. "Something's wrong with the goats." I raced upstairs for a better view. The closer I approached the window, the more their panic intensified. Without waiting for my mother's response, I retrieved my AR rifle, a weapon I'd trained extensively with, but hoped never to need for protection. I verified the magazine, chambered a round, and disengaged the safety before heading outside again. The cold air felt even more aggressive now, as if it carried hostile intent. As I approached the goat pen, I found them huddled together, trembling, eyes wide with a fear that transcended normal animal anxiety. I slowly circled the perimeter, sweeping my flashlight across the shadows. At the far end of the pen, my light caught something. Initially, I mistook it for a crouching deer, but as the beam illuminated it fully, my breath stalled in my lungs. The entity was vaguely humanoid, but profoundly wrong in its proportions. Impossibly thin, its limbs extended at unnatural angles from a torso that seemed more architectural than biological. Its skin possessed a ghostly pallor that seemed to absorb rather than reflect my flashlight's beam. Most disturbing was its face, or rather the absence of one. Where features should have existed stretched only a smooth, featureless expanse, interrupted solely by milky, clouded eyes that contained no pupil, no iris, just an empty opalescence that somehow still conveyed the sensation of watching. I remained paralyzed, gripped by a fear so profound it transcended the physical response of flight. I managed only to raise my rifle with trembling hands. The entity moved, not with the deliberate motion of muscle and sinew, but with a sudden spatial discontinuity. It didn't run or walk, it simply ceased to occupy its original position, and briefly transitioned elsewhere before vanishing entirely. My legs finally responded, and I fled back to the house, securing the door behind me. My mother's concerned expression greeted me in the living room. When she asked what had happened, I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd witnessed. Something instinctual warned against giving it shape through words. "Everything's fine," I lied, though she clearly recognized my terror. That night, as I futilely attempted sleep, a scream pierced the silence, a woman's voice, distorted and distant, yet carrying with unnatural clarity. The sound contained a quality that felt fundamentally wrong, as if it originated from something mimicking human vocalization, rather than producing it naturally. The following morning, I returned to check on the goats, my rifle ready. The sounds of normal life had resumed. Distant traffic, barking dogs, birdsong, everything appeared as it should. Until I reached the pen, the disturbed soil told its own story. Just beyond the fence lay one of our goats, body intact but head completely absent, the separation too clean for any natural predator. Whatever had visited us possessed strength beyond natural explanation, precision beyond animal capability, and intelligence enough to understand what would horrify us most. I've since learned from my grandfather that similar entities have been reported in these mountains for generations, though rarely witnessed in daylight, as I had seen it. He believes what I encountered matches traditional descriptions of the Wendigo, not merely a creature, but a manifestation of insatiable hunger and winter's deadliest aspects. We remain vigilant now. The entity has demonstrated its awareness of us, its ability to approach undetected, and its willingness to take what belongs to us. Most disturbing of all, it showed no fear of humans, only curiosity. The kind of curiosity a predator exhibits when studying potential prey, learning patterns, and planning its approach. The forest feels different now. The shadows seem deliberate. And sometimes, on unexpectedly cold mornings, I catch myself listening for unnatural silence, the first warning that it has returned.
The voice came from the hallway. Submitted by Stallhammer. Our first week in our new home contained an experience that defies explanation to this day. 4 days after my parents' unsettling first night, the phenomena intensified. One evening, as my parents lay in bed watching television, a child's voice emanated from the hallway. Mama, I'd called, a plaintive, lonely sound followed by a drawn-out mama. My mother, assuming it was my sister or me, asked my father to check on us. Reluctantly, he rose and navigated the darkened hallway, peering into each bedroom. They're both sleeping, he reported, closing their bedroom door. That's strange, my mother responded. I distinctly heard someone say mama twice. Before she finished speaking, the voice returned. The same sudden mama followed by that elongated, haunting mama. My mother insisted he check again. This time my father switched on the hallway light, conducting a more thorough investigation. He returned, confirming we remained soundly asleep. No sooner had he settled back under the covers than the voice resumed. Before my father could rise, their bedroom door slowly swung open on its own. Mama, called the voice from the empty doorway. Mama! They heard measured footsteps approaching the bed, though nothing was visible in the television's blue glow. The voice called again, now directly beside them. Oh my God, Barry, my mother whispered, clutching my father's arm. It thinks I'm its mother. As she spoke, the mattress beside her depressed visibly. Something unseen had seated itself against her legs. She felt a cold, substantial weight pressing against her lower body. Barry, I think it's sitting on my legs. What do I do? My father lunged upward, waving his hands frantically through the space above my mother's legs. Get out of here, he shouted, continuing his desperate movements, as if to physically disperse whatever had manifested. My mother felt the weight lift immediately. My father continued demanding the entity depart until convinced it had gone. Neither slept much that night, and when morning arrived, they checked on us children again, finding us still peacefully unaware of the nocturnal visitation. This incident marked only the beginning. Over the subsequent 30 years, numerous inexplicable events would unfold in that house, including, remarkably, an occasion when an unseen entity served my father pie and provided him with a blanket, an occurrence so extraordinary it deserves its own telling.